In less than 14 days, 18 political parties allocated the 400 National Assembly seats are expected to form a national coalition government that will pave a way for the 7th administration. This week, Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who is expected to officially receive the lists of designated members of Parliament from the Independent Electoral Commission in preparation for the first sitting of the National Assembly, which he will preside over the election of key parliamentary and provincial officials. To talk more about the constitutional processes following the elections, we are joined by Professor Pierre de Vos, who of course is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Cape Town. Professor, always good having you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's get the question out the way about, we've seen these election results now being released and announced, but they haven't necessarily been declared as yet, have they? Or talk to us about the differences.
Well, in terms of the Electoral Act, the Electoral Commission, within 7 days from the election, has to declare formally the results. So what happens at the results center is the procedure, or the song and dance, so to speak, but there has to be a formal legal declaration of the results. I don't know if it was done on Sunday already, or maybe it was done yesterday. I haven't checked that. And then from that day, from the day that it's actually formally legally declared, there's 14 days for the National Assembly to have its first sitting, where they're then going to elect the Speaker, Deputy Speaker, and the President.
So there are still a couple of issues that are being contested against the elections. A lot of parties have called foul play, and there are still some outstanding issues. How does this affect the election results and them being declared?
Yeah. So the Electoral Act says that the election can be declared, the results can be declared, even if not every single problem has been resolved, as long as it's not going to have a material impact on the results. So they can still resolve those issues, but the results are declared, and they are allowed to do that in terms of the Electoral Act.
Okay. I mean, we've seen many coming up. I mean, we even saw the UDM coming forward yesterday and saying they were not happy with their seat allocations because by their calculations, they should have more seats than they have been given. Surely this has a big issue, especially when we're talking about the allocation of seats.
Yeah. So the allocation of seats happens in terms of a formula. So it is set out in the Act. I have no idea because I haven't checked the formula, and I'm not very good at math to start with. But if there is a problem, obviously they can appeal and they can go to the Electoral Court. But it is not clear whether this is just them not understanding how the specific formula works, or whether they really have a valid issue.
Yeah, and that I think they did even put forward in that press advisory, just talking about even they were a little confused as to how the allocation works. So that's quite an intricate issue that, as you say, both you and I won't be getting into in terms of those actual numbers. But what I want to know now, and I think it's quite important, I mean, obviously the IEC has already allocated both the legislature, regional and provincial seats. But with the candidates not happy, some having lodged objections, can they, however, change the order of the names of the people that were on the lists originally? Because we know those were handed in. But is that now open to changing and moving as to what number they were originally on those lists from political parties?
Yes, so for the moment they cannot parties cannot shuffle their list. They can add names to the end of the list. But there's a provision in the Act that after this is all done, then parties will be able to shuffle their lists, not only add names at the bottom, but also change the order so that if they want to get somebody into parliament, they can do so through the shuffle and maybe recalling one of the people who have already been elected as one of the MPs. Then there's a vacancy, and then the top person on their list that they have reshuffled will then go to parliament.
Yeah, so that's important, and I think it's a question a lot of people are asking for. So, I mean, if for instance, somebody's name was at number 25, and now that they've seen how many seats have been allocated and they've only been given X amount of seats, but 25 does not include them, can they shuffle them up the list and make sure that they get into it?
Yeah. So they cannot do it right now, but at a later stage, yes, they can do it. But to decide who, we will have to see who's allocated to which list, because it's complicated, because there are actually 10 lists from which people are designated to the National Assembly, one from each province for each party, and then the compensatory national list. So it's quite complicated. I tried to work out some of the seats, but it's not so easy to do. We'll have to see what the names actually are.
It certainly is, because, I mean, even looking at something like the MK party, and we know what was going on with the number one on the list, which is the former President Jacob Zuma, and we've heard all about the court wranglings there, that he is not necessarily allowed to go into the National Assembly. That's what the courts have found. So there has to be a move around there as well, and there are still things outstanding in terms of who's actually leading the party. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes of all of that. Will this affect anything going forward?
Well, in the future, it might affect the decisions that the parties take once they are allowed to shuffle their lists and arrange things differently. Maybe ask people who have been elected to the National Assembly to step back so that other people can take their seats. But that wouldn't change what's happening in the next 2 weeks, which is, and especially what will happen in 14 days' time, or 12 days' time, when the National Assembly will meet to do the formal swearing in and then the election, as I said.
Yeah, okay, so let's do that. Let's outline it for South Africans as to exactly what's going to happen. So we've got 18 parties, allocated seats in the National Assembly. There's 14 days to do this. It's gone down now to 12 days. Talk us through some of the main constitutional processes that need to be followed now.
So the interesting thing is that the Constitution doesn't really provide any guidance on when one party doesn't win a majority. For the forming of the government, the only thing that is pivotal is the election of the president. So, because the president is the head of the executive and the head of state, and the president is the one who formally appoints all the cabinet ministers. If there's no coalition agreement when the National Assembly first meet, then the National Assembly will still have to elect a president and speaker and deputy speaker, and everything depends on that election. If there are several candidates, then there will be several rounds of voting if no candidate wins absolute majority of the votes. So until there are two candidates and one of those candidates win a majority of the votes. A majority of the votes is not the majority of the 400 members who are elected to the National Assembly. It's the majority of the votes actually cast. So if a party decides we're not going to take part in the vote, they just don't have any impact on the election. It's only the votes that are actually cast in the National Assembly that will determine who is actually then elected president of the country.
These votes, are they a public vote or a private vote? How do they work once we get there?
So Schedule 3 of the Constitution actually requires this vote to be secret. It needs to be done by secret ballot, which might complicate matters slightly. And so we wouldn't know necessarily how people voted, although political parties will, of course, instruct their members in the National Assembly to vote in a specific way. It's going to be interesting to see if those instructions are then obeyed by all the MPs, because we wouldn't know who they actually voted for.
It certainly is. But so once this sitting happens, now everybody's got their positions, they're in the National Assembly. Now you have a president put forward for voting on and a Speaker of the National Assembly. But how are these candidates chosen?
So anybody in the candidates must come from among the members in the National Assembly, and anybody in the Assembly can nominate somebody. There's a process, there are forms that the Chief Justice in regulations have provided, and so there will be nominations, and then once the nominations have been received, we will know how many candidates there are, and then there will be the election, as I pointed out, perhaps different if there are more than two candidates, several rounds of voting until there is a winner.
All right, so here's the interesting one, and I go back to some things that the MK party have been saying. They've said it might boycott that first parliamentary sitting. That's what they've been threatening. So my question to you, Professor, is what is actually required for a quorum of ordinary decisions in the National Assembly needed to elect the president? If they're not there and their members are not there, is this going to affect the outcome, or is there a way of working around it?
Yes, so I've seen that. I think there are some people who confuse the provision in the Constitution that says the side of the National Assembly must be between 350 and 400. We know that the size of the National Assembly is 400 because the Electoral Act, Section 114, read with Schedule 3, makes clear that the National Assembly has 400 MPs. The only way in which that provision will become relevant if this Parliament change the Electoral Act and reduce the number of MPs in the National Assembly to less than 350. And if they don't do that, there are 400 MPs, then Section 53 says, no matter who attends the sitting, whether they are sworn in, what is required is that at least 1/3 of the members of the National Assembly must be present for a decision to be taken. 1/2 if legislation is passed, but for other decisions, 1/3. So 134 MPs must at least be present for there to be a quorum for a vote to take place.
So in simple language, whether MK is there or not on that first sitting, the voting will go ahead?
It will make absolutely no difference. The voting will go on. There will be a quorum. Of course, if the MK members don't attend, and they don't attend for 15 consecutive sessions, then they're going to lose their seats unless they make a valid excuse, and this is accepted by the National Assembly. But I suspect we won't get to that point.
So members of the national legislature and the 9 provincial legislatures are elected based on a party list, compensatory proportional representation, that's the PR system. Did the Electoral Amendment Act impact this process at all?
Well, the Act was amended to allow for independent candidates also to stand. It made it more complicated. As we all know, those of us who voted, you had to vote on 2 different ballots for the National Assembly, which slowed things down. It's part of the problems with the election that the IEC experienced. But in the end, it didn't really have a big impact in the sense that no independent candidates were elected. It's still proportional. The outcome is still proportional. It still allows a party with about 0.25% of the vote, slightly less perhaps, to get 1 seat in the National Assembly. So in that sense, it hasn't really made, to the results at least, any significant difference.
Important question. Okay, because we saw, as you say, now there's no independent candidates. But here's an important question, and one that's got me thinking here. What happens should a national coalition government not agree on the election of the president? What happens? Where to then? Do we go to new elections?
No, that is not possible because new elections are only possible if the National Assembly is dissolved. That can only happen if there is a vacancy in the office of the president at this stage. The Constitution makes clear that the current president serves until the new president is elected, so there's no vacancy. What will happen is there will have to still be a vote. The parties will then decide, are we going to vote for candidate X or candidate Y? And somebody will be elected. Then it will be a minority government if there's no coalition agreement. The president elected will be able to form a government, but of course, that will be precarious because in terms of Section 102 of the Constitution, the National Assembly can also pass a vote of no confidence in the President and the Cabinet, and then they are ousted. And there will have to be, within 30 days in that case, another election for a new President. So if there's no agreement, there still will be President elected. It will still form a government, but it will be a minority government, and it is likely to be, or it could potentially be rather unstable. So it would be better to have some kind of agreement before the election obviously happens. But even if a president is elected, then that president could then cobble together a coalition after the election of the presidency. That is, of course, also possible.